Studio Potter. So this month we have a story for you about the relationship between artists and galleries. And over the summer, we talked with several artists, and there were about 4 artists and administrators attached to institutions in the United States to look at this relationship and see how it could evolve, what are some of the difficulties of navigating it. And this was all inspired by a conversation with Osat To, who is still relatively new to the field, although she has a great following on Instagram and is definitely somebody who's coming up in the field and was invited to be part of the American Pottery Festival this year. And she's just figuring out how is it sustainable to be a ceramic artist in 2020 and have an equitable agreement with organizations. So a name that kept coming up in these conversations was Sunshine Cobb. And so I decided that we should have a conversation with Sunshine, and she's here with us today. Hi, Sunshine.
Hey, Jill, how's it going?
So Sunshine, can you start by telling us an abridged version of the journey that you went through to initially establish your own market, especially the evolution of your relationship with the gallery system?
So I think I went through a more traditional background as far as my education goes. So I went undergrad, grad school, and when I got out of grad school, at the time there was lots of applying to juried exhibitions. And frankly, I didn't have the money at the time to apply to those types of things. So what I ended up doing was looking at galleries that I wanted to be in. And I worked through all of their gallery submission pages. And I basically put my work in their email boxes, or maybe there might have been some slide places at times like that. It was like that long ago. I was sort of at that cusp of transition from slides to digital, but I basically just put my name out there with some of the places that I wanted to be and waited to kind of hear back. And for me, it ended up being kind of this interesting journey, because I maybe didn't get into their gallery, but within a year or two, I was invited to exhibitions, kind of like the American Pottery Festival. So my work started popping up in magazines and around, and I kind of started that way. And truthfully, it was very difficult because I couldn't really, I would say from a career standpoint and visibility standpoint, I couldn't afford to say no to some of these organizations. But financially, it was an incredible hardship to ship work there, ship work back, sell meagerly, or have inventory put on a shelf that stayed on a shelf for a long time, kind of thing. And so in certain places also, to be a part of these kind of exhibitions that were less about kind of a long-term relationship with the gallery and more of a short-term exhibition, like month-long type thing, where maybe they had an expo type event. And those were, sometimes required, like American Pottery Festival, or suggested that you show up. And for me on the West Coast, made that very difficult to, financially, to pay for airfare. And really most of the time, I would say the majority of every single, with the exception of maybe 2, so I would call them pottery festivals, is sort of how I manage gallery inclusion in the beginning. I broke even on all of them. Really, maybe if I was lucky, I broke even. And I think, so that's really started me, I would say, fast forward then to me trying to figure out how to make a living doing this thing as an independent maker, with no kind of, I couldn't subsidize that kind of exposure and shipping and all that with a day job. I was really just trying to make ends meet. And that ended up forcing me to look at what my expenses were, what I had access to, why it was so important for me to have a website. Right when I got out of school, that was energy I put straight towards building an online platform for myself that people could find me no matter what. And so that was kind of how started me down the road of that I could make more money and support myself, um, initially by just working to, like, even having a website. It cost me like 1 mug a month to like have a website that had a pay shop, that kind of thing. That's kind of like where I ended up with um, really starting to strive kind of in a way away from galleries, or at least not having the majority of my work sold in galleries.
And you have really specific guidelines now for your relationships with galleries. I'm curious how, I mean, you were speaking a little bit to how that evolved, was just you're realizing that it had to be sustainable, but what did that look like, the nuts and bolts of you changing your personal relationship with them?
Yeah, I think what my eager beaver overachiever side when I first started was, if they asked for something like 12 to 16 pots, I would send 20. Or, that was kind of, I always sent more. And when I started to make this shift of understanding that, actually, I mean, it kind of came in this moment where I realized I spent more on shipping than any other expense in my studio. And that shipping was to galleries. It wasn't to anybody else. It was these sort of large order, or large, I would say, commission based kind of places I would sell work. And so the first thing I put in place for myself was, one, to, I mean, this relationship with galleries is very much related to how I tried to develop my business at the same time. And so I kind of set a goal for myself in my own personal business, which was to sell 500 mugs myself. And so I devoted like the month of January to make 500 mugs. And then I would work to sell each of those ones myself. And then, because what I realized was, so I think sometimes this kind of equation and this conversation, it's really important to do the math of your life, to understand what it costs to live, what it costs to have a studio, what it costs to make work. And I think sometimes it comes back to that idea of pricing. But if you're only making half of what you've made that equation to equal this amount that I charge for a mug, and then you give half of that away to a gallery, and you don't necessarily give, they earn it for what they do most of the time, it changes the equation significantly. It means you can't make ends meet. So along with that, sell 100 mugs myself, the next step was to no longer be the overachiever and send the minimum number of pockets they asked. So if they asked for 12 to 16, I sent 12. And that set me up to, because in the beginning, and, is that they would ask for these pots, and then they would ask for more pots because they'd sold all those pots. And part of that, I would say, equitable relationship with galleries is that you send work there, they send the work back, right? That's how the shipping issue is handled. But if they're never sending pots back, it's not very equitable, in addition to asking for more work. So it for me opened up the conversation. For me, part of it sometimes is about having those, like, how do I set myself up, or how do you set yourself up to have a difficult conversation related to money? And a lot of times we are honored and excited to be asked to be a part of an exhibition or a gallery someplace because it's on our wish list. And for me, this was this moment of saying, how do I find some agency for myself to have a conversation, open up the conversation to, I'd be happy to send more pots if you'd like to pay for shipping, right? Because I'm like, I really had to get okay with, I am happy with the number of pots I sent you under the current arrangement, but we're going to renegotiate a new arrangement if we're going forward. And I think there is this non-artist hat you have to put on, and you have to be willing to be okay with your decision. Even if maybe you really wanted them to want more pots and pay for shipping, you have to be okay with it. Well, they didn't go for it, and that's okay. But that inventory remains on your shelf, and you can work to sell it.
So that brings up something that came up in the group conversations, which was trying to initiate those hard conversations and being met with kind of a stone wall, especially if the communication was happening via email. And then there seemed to be, if you could get to a person-to-person conversation, that things were more malleable. So how, yeah, can you talk a little bit more about, like, did you run into walls, or did you find ever there were people that just ignored the conversation?
I would say, I, I think in the beginning, I would call people. I would sort of say, I'm going to have this conversation over the phone, because truthfully, it's harder to ignore somebody when they're actually talking at you. um, so, but no, I definitely ran into issues where people were unreceptive. And so I think I worked to have a very clear argument about why I felt it was fair and why I was okay with not participating then. Of like, okay, then I'm fine with what I've sent. Thank you so much. Like I always am grateful to be included and participate. And I think this takes me also into kind of the workshop arena, where I've had more email exchanges in that regard. And have learned to be very clear and concise about what my expectations are. Um, and am able to keep a record of that. Then that conversation is then saved, so that if I have problems in the future with that organization or whatever, I can say, no, this is what I said I wanted and you agreed to when you hired me, kind of thing. So and I think I've had those sort of flat out refusals, and I do find my very best to try, because I do recognize at this moment, especially, or at this point in my career, I'm in an incredibly privileged position, because I can afford to say no and stick to that. I'm not in a situation where I am, like, I think I understand, like, the balance of the math is really important. If I'm confronted with unfair pay, like someone wanting to pay me what I consider unfair, that doesn't even cover my time or expense um, away from the studio, or like airfare, whatever that is, I can clearly lay out why that's not a fair, or that's not an equitable pay scale or whatever. And I've had people, say, thank you very much, we'll move on. And I was like, okay, thanks. And I think also I'd like to point this out, is that there is a huge, um, it's a more difficult conversation for women to have, and to be confronted by men that tell you, gosh, that's a lot of money, little lady, kind of crap, because I've run into a lot of that. And I don't particularly pay heed. I mean, I just kind of am like, well, that's a really offensive thing to say to me. So, that sort of thing of like, if you want that other person to come. But I think it is kind of a really important distinction to make, that we don't have a lot of agency, or there's some space in there that make it very difficult for women to have these conversations in general.
Yeah, that is an important distinction to make, because there was also the question of, as it goes, as it's trying to change right now, but difficult for women, difficult for a person of color to have a conversation that potentially, wouldn't be difficult for other people to have, to put it simply. It's not like you're just relying on sales of your wares, right? You have really diversified your income stream. And when you talk about workshops, that comes to mind. But can you tell us about the ways that you have diversified your revenue streams, and how that has helped push your brand forward?
I think that is also a really important thing. I do believe the optics of ceramics is sometimes that people are making a boatload of money off their work. I have not found that to be the case. The reality is, if I think about my income over I would say the past 5 years, I at least somewhere, I would say about 65 to 70% of my income comes from workshop revenue, right? And so that could also mean selling work at workshops, or just income made at workshops. And then somewhere like, and also having written a book, that's another revenue stream. And selling work. So another thing about the galleries is, what I also learned, this is just kind of a weird side note, and maybe, is that I ended up deciding to limit the number of galleries that I was in. I would find that in particular galleries, I didn't do well, the work just sat. And it was also, if they were markets that I couldn't access for some reason, that seemed like a good idea to have work there. But I usually keep my galleries to 3 to 5 at the moment. And I work really hard to sell work myself because, when I looked at that idea of selling 500 mugs myself versus 500 mugs in a gallery, that's twice the amount of mugs I would have to make to earn the same income. And so I've really devoted my platforms, social media, website to really diversify and sort of cut out the middlemen. As much as it's like I think about American Pottery Festival. I love working with Northern Clay Center. I think they're a great bunch of people and they're really fun to spend time with. It's not a moneymaker for me, right? It's just not. I think, and I think that's kind of that illusion we have to sort of look at and say, what is financial success regarding like the sales of work? I think we have, and I'm also really lucky. Is like I grew up in a family. We owned our own business. We owned a pet store growing up, and so I understand what it means to be a customer service, do customer service, to have a retail shop, to work towards sort of building a reasonable business practice. And I think there is some negotiation with like the soul of an artist and the head brain of a business person, but I have run into circumstances, where like I would say like my time with Objective Clay, it was really interesting when we first got together and we're working to kind of set up a shop or try to figure that stuff out. People would sort of say things like, oh, it'd be great if we sold, $10,000 worth of work off the website. And I was like, yeah, that would be great if only we had $10,000 worth of inventory on the website. So like there's a direct correlation to understanding what you have to what you can earn. And I think sometimes we have to step back from our maker selves and our artist selves. And, because I think, a person that's a really wonderful example of this is like Hisu Lee. She can only make a limited number of things. Her objects are so time intensive and so amazing. And there's a price point that matches that. And it's not my $50 mug, right? It's a very different market stream. And so a revenue stream and market stream. So, it's interesting to think that she could work to sell 2 mugs and make more than she would get paid for a week-long workshop. Right? Those are like doing the math of that scenario of like, is it really worth it? Can she make a couple mugs a week? Where are we with time? And that's not the only reason maybe, why people teach. But it is one of the factors. For me, it is about earning income and making sure I'm practicing a sustainable sort of business practice.
I think that's interesting that you bring up Hisu, because that was a conversation that came up. We talked with Jennifer Zwilling from the Clay Studio and Leslie Farron and Catherine Gremley from Penland. And just that those are all very different models, right? Of what they're trying to do. And so I think sometimes that like we all know that, but then I think it gets lost in the shuffle, right? That like what is a good fit for you, because of the gallery that could move Sunshine Cobb maybe would have a harder time moving Hisu Lee, right? And we have to figure that out. You talked about social media, right, with Objective Clay and then your own development, but can you get a little deeper in there and tell us like how do you think social media has changed the field? Do you think that the pandemic is going to shift our focus back to local markets, or do you think there's going to be a hybrid between the internet, social media, and local markets?
So I think that's a really interesting question, because I think it also I can speak to what it's done for me personally. So, okay, well, first let's talk about social media and then we'll talk pandemic. What I think is interesting and what's changed even from the time that I got on social media, which is maybe roughly how old is Instagram? Maybe 7 or 8 years old at the most. If that old, I don't know. I think it's really changed significantly how you develop followers. The algorithms have changed. So I actually think it's a lot more difficult to grow sometimes those numbers, to have followers and have a have a reliable base of people that are interested in what you're doing. And also how many people actually see, what I do. For me, I haven't spent the energy to like dive into becoming a social media expert. It's also not, because I also, as a teacher, I am always sort of encouraging my students not to participate on it as much, especially in the beginning, because I think it can skew your idea of working on your craft, to the idea of marketing and selling your work way too fast. I think that there's a space between that needs to happen. Like there's a confidence, and I think it's and I actually think that's something that's changed in the pandemic, is that it's become a source for people to learn and connect with people in a very different way. And then sometimes the only way that they have access to creative spaces right now. I think that has changed a little bit. So yeah, social media for me has been a really important thing. And during this year, I've cultivated it differently. Just, I think, kind of in a weird, like as an emotional reaction, in addition to a survival mechanism, as far as that goes. And as far as, so pandemic wise, I'm curious about how, so for me, when I think about it, because what I was going to say was like, for me personally, the pandemic has really shifted my priorities. In that, what it has shown to me is kind of having this conversation of like fair pay and revenue streams, is that it has made it very clear what my vulnerabilities are, financially, health-wise. And I think that's part of the reason this conversation has taken place about fair pay and working with different institutions as an independent maker, is because I don't have any institution looking out for me and taking care of my health care, or like I don't have paid sick leave. I don't have these things that, like right as we went into lockdown, I was supposed to go on a trip that was 4 flights there and 4 flights home. And the reality was I would get sick regardless of a pandemic. And that would take me, like, that is a lot of travel for a couple $1,000s. Like it just really, it was like, and also for me, what has, I think, with Black Lives Matter and really looking at BIPOC populations in our ceramics community, realizing how limited and exclusive and predominantly white the workshops that I go teach at are, right? That the access to the knowledge that I share is incredibly exclusive in that way. And for me, I think what has shifted also is the making work has become, in a weird way, less of a priority. I kind of feel like I'm going into a bit of a dry spell with it, because it's been really hard to find creative space and energy in my heart. But what has flourished and what has become important is offering my teaching skills and my knowledge and sharing that in this online world platform. That means I don't actually have to be where you are, and I can open up access to a huge population that would have never gotten to see me before. And so for me, it's a huge shift, and one that I'm not returning to anytime in the foreseeable future. To me, it's more important, and I think proving more viable to people, that because they can directly support me and I can support them in their learning practice, and it can open up a lot of doors and possibilities for that kind of connection and teaching, for me anyways.
Have you noticed with your, so I first want to establish that what you have been doing is you've been, through your Instagram feed, you've been doing demos for people, right? For whoever wants to tune in and watch them. But have you noticed that that is shifting the demographic? Like how would you know that that's making that kind of impact?
Basically starting last year and then into this year, I had started doing these kind of online demos, just working through objects. And the reality is, of when the pandemic hit, I had less than $300 in the bank, and everything had been canceled for the year. And I was like, okay, nobody kind of thought it was going to be canceled for the year, but I was like, everything's canceled for the year. That's like, and immediately was my brain. And the thought of trying to sell work felt really um, not good, felt really bad. It felt like this, I can't ask people to spend money on pots. But so I looked to my own practice and was like, um, what can I do to serve the community? And how can I ask them to help me? And that was kind of the space that I decided to start these doing lessons. So I've been doing online Zoom lessons for $25 a pop kind of thing. And during the initial beginning of the pandemic, after the class, I put everything online for free for a while, so that if people couldn't afford to pay $25, they could still have access. And so, and the answer to your question is yes, a lot of people have reached out and told me that they would have never been able to come see me at any of the places. I mean, the crazy thing is I have been to every single state in the United States because of ceramics. I have traveled from Alaska to Hawaii to Florida, everywhere. And the reality is I still only serve 15 to 30 people at a time. Like that's kind of that number, right? And so to be able to have folks in class and a Zoom call, like I just hosted one the other Saturday, you know, I had 90 people enrolled from all over the world and all different kind of classes and people that have been working at their kitchen tables that don't have access. And I think it has just been proven over and over to me that this kind of accessibility is really, it's really important to my teaching practice for sure. And sharing that kind of creative space for people has changed how I've thought about moving forward.
If you're giving this content away, when you, I mean, I understand some of them you're for $25 a piece, but when you're giving it away, how is that increasing your revenue? How does that impact your sales of objects?
So it was funny, I was talking to Lindsay earlier today and we were kind of talking about business practices and how we, because I get confronted with that idea that I'm giving information away. And I think for some folks, they can have some real harsh judgment about that. And what I am trying to share with people is not how you make a mug. That's not what I'm sharing with people. What I'm trying to share, because there's 17,000 different ways to make a mug. Like, I mean, we're in the ceramics field. There's a million ways to do it. What I am interested in is helping people find their creative selves and to find creative space for themselves and some agency within the ceramic space, right? And at the moment, most people's ceramic space is at their kitchen table. And I don't, and so I think there is for me about this, like, I think there's I'm not gonna remember the name of it, but I know there is, her name's Sonia Taylor. She's a Black Lives Matter activist, and she was talking about it's kind of a movement to pay down Black debt. This idea of having community that helps us reach our goals, and that you know, and this is like one of those things that is hard, I think, and maybe people can be defensive or threatened by this notion, is that there is some space, at least in my business practice and my creative practice, of vulnerability, of saying, hey, I need your help to survive. If you enjoy what I do and want to participate with me, then I actually need your financial support. And that is either in buying mugs and tools or books, or paying for a class for 25 bucks. And I think, you know, I learned this back when I did a crowdfunding campaign, was that $5 or $500 all felt like folks were on my team. They wanted to participate. They wanted to see me succeed. And I don't necessarily feel that, like, that idea that we're competing with each other in this kind of space. I mean, there is limited bandwidth in theory, but I don't know. I just feel like more creative space and more people working towards kind of a that idea that, because I think that's what's interesting too, is to think about, like you brought up earlier, of like, do you think it's going to come back to this like local market? I have worked to cultivate a market that is online, that is like that they find me and we do this thing together in this way. Um, and so I really am kind of more about this idea that we have to work to take care of each other. And so um, I have found that my generosity is met with gratitude and support.
I just looked up real quick what you were talking about, and you got her name right. It's Sonia Renee Taylor. Just so that people can look it up on their own, I just want to read the synopsis of it, but it's Buy Back Black Debt. And it's a project of interracial, spiritual, and economic relationship building. And the goal is not simply to pay off the random debt of Black folks, but to reestablish the possibility of human connections and relationship through disrupting active institutions of white supremacist delusion in Black lives. It says this project is not a gift. You're not gifting or donating any other language steeped in white saviorism. You're seeking relationship in which you would like to clear up some of your spiritual debt by doing your part to mitigate the harm your people have done to Black people via institutions of white supremacist delusion. Did you read that, and then that, were you already thinking along those lines, and then that just affirmed for you what everything you just spoke to?
I think so I've been following her on social media for a little while, and I think she does a lot, she posts a lot of videos and sort of dialogues a lot about she was going through when I first discovered her, she was going through having her student loan debt, which was relieved, and that was like, I was like, oh my gosh, how is she doing this? This kind of amazing thing. And so, and what struck me, and I think I maybe believed in some part of my studio practice, was this idea that we need each other and our communities to support each other. And this idea that the only way to get out of debt is to fight your way free from it is very difficult. Like this sort of, that we're alone in this sort of journey. And I think that as someone who suffers from a lot of student debt, I worry about that too. I think about that, and I think what she said spoke to me in this way that I think was manifesting in my own life and my own practice of this generosity being met with generosity, and that doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be finite. I don't believe it's finite. I believe that it's kind of like the love people have for their children. You don't love, it's like there is love begets love. There's this growth in those spaces, and I believe that with generosity is that once we start withholding and being sort of very territorial about stuff, I think it's not, well, for me as a person, it hasn't, I don't see a lot of prosperity there. At least and maybe they have financial prosperity, but I feel there can be this vacuum of no kind of soul or spirit that I want to participate with. So
it sounds like you're really talking about operating from a place of abundance as opposed to a place of scarcity, is what it comes down to. And yeah, I think it's great. It's great to think about all of these. It's so multi-layered that we start off talking about business practices, and you can't extract one from the other now. Maybe you never should have been able to. But I do want to bring it back around to, with this shifting landscape, I mean, what do you think galleries, what is the role that galleries play now? Do you think they're still a relevant part of the ecosystem? And do you have ideas about how that relationship can shift?
Ooh, that's a big question. I have no idea how. I think it's really hard because I do feel I've had a lot of conversations with kind of makerspace and like a lot of galleries that also have like ceramic studios, And I've had lots of conversations with those folks, and I've had to really put some boundaries up and say, is this like if they wanted me to do, say, an online workshop, and I would have to have these conversations where I'm like, is your intention to make income? Are you interested in generating income for your institution, or are you interested in serving your institution, like it, or the people that populate your institution? Because both of us unfortunately can't get paid in this scenario, like that idea. And so, or at least you can't pay me fairly. And so I've had lots of conversations where I try to give them as kind of, I give them a lot of like my experience and what I've learned in this kind of um, online Zoom world that we're in. Um, but I think they're kind of having to 100% redefine how they're going to operate. And I think at this moment, we're also, like, I made a post and I think you responded to it a long while back about this, like me getting kind of irate and doing an Instagram rant about fair pay and this kind of more vote, like that idea. So the like leaders in the field, like someone like me, or anybody else that has kind of a stronger platform, um, making sure that you have these conversations about fair pay, about equality. Like I turned down several workshops in the very early part of COVID because um, people wanted me to come in, pay me very inadequately. But also I was like, listen, are you taking care of your teachers that live in New York or wherever you are? Because they need those resources right now. The people in your community want to support them. I don't need to be beamed in from Montana. Like, it's not supportive to them. Like, and I think we have to kind of think a little bit, a little farther downstream when we're trying to like look at this idea that um, I can command a particular amount, a dollar amount, right? That does not mean the person that just got out of grad school that has no Instagram followers can demand that kind of fair pay either. But we should both be afforded a living wage in this kind of, if we're looking at situations, um, like it's that idea of like, do you take care of one person well, or do you give a pittance to 20 people? Like, is that better or worse? Like, and so I think I think I've had some really wonderful conversations with institutions who have taken what I've said to heart and worked really hard to make sure their artists and the people that they are um, giving their platform to feel like they are being paid fairly, and in that like a local sort of sense too. So I do believe there is a renegotiation happening. But I do look at some institutions and think they are operating in a some type of bizarre orbit where they're not really participating in the conversation. Institutions that I have donated time to or worked with that had in a good time not paid people super fairly, looking to take advantage of those people again in even more dire sort of circumstance.
Well, another thing that did come up in the conversation was that, not all artists and not all galleries or all institutions that operate in the craft world are equal, and some have better practices than others. And it really seemed like most of the people that we were talking to, actually had really good practices, and would even, like Catherine Grimley was talking about how she would train young artists to read their contract and have conversations and hold other organizations like to the contract. One of the reasons your name came up was that it was put out there that you had this notion about artists unionizing to ensure this fair pay. And so tell us a little bit about that. How did that notion get out there in the world?
Okay, it did come from my crazy rant on Instagram about fair pay. Because what and I think it also comes from like Kristen Kiefer's article in Ceramics Monthly of last year. Oh gosh, was that I can't even tell what year it is anymore. Anyways, it was a while back, but it was this kind of discrepancy in pay. And I looked at it at the time more from a gender gap kind of idea, this idea that that women traditionally ask for less money than men. And like when it's left up to an artist, that to say, okay, I'm going to dictate how much I get paid. There's a lot of psychology that goes into that number, right? There's just a lot. And that if you're going to have a flat rate or, like that. So I think part of it was its idea of like implementing some kind of standard of what was an appropriate amount of money to pay basically a gig worker. I look at like what California is doing right now to try to figure out how to get gig workers health insurance and different types of stuff. And like, how do, as much as, like it's really difficult to be an independent contractor and like, the trying to navigate the healthcare system at the moment, like all of those things are really difficult to prove how much money you make and why you have, 10 different W-2s from 10 different states and what that means to the state you live, that like all this kind of information. So that idea of having some kind of union in a strange way, as much as we're a small community, makes some kind of sense. I don't know. And that's the thing. I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked into unionizing and what that would entail. And given the current climate, who knows what the world will do. But I do believe there is this, there's enough folks, like I always think it's interesting. I think about NCECA and going to like the 50 Friends talk. And what was always interesting, I was invited a couple times, and it would be me and maybe 3 or 4 independent studio artists, and the rest were educators. And it makes sense. Education is a big part of NCECA, but it was really always very frustrating because these kind of notions or the topics that people would come up were always these topics like one conversation we talked about racism and how to get more people of color interested in clay. And I looked around the room and I was like, okay, all of you have institutional support. You can be in every single grade school giving demonstrations. You can do all of this kind of service to help generationally introduction to the arts. Me as a person trying to like, sell my soul for $50, like this is insanity, right? That you're asking me to make those choices that seem like your institutions would support. Like you're getting a paycheck to do service, this kind of thing. And so I've had these conversations where it's really, but I also actually feel like the scale has tipped as far as there's a lot more independent studio artists because there's a limited number of educational jobs anymore. And so, and what is also the frustrating thing too is that it is not something that I have witnessed a ton of, and anybody out there that is in education and is advocating for their students in this way, bravo. But, when I was going to school, which is not that long ago, it was 10 years ago, neither of my professors had like that idea of professional practices and what that meant. It wasn't looking at contracts. Those guys, they didn't even have websites. They didn't even understand the world that they were putting me into to try to talk about the real cost of what all of this is. And I think that, the biggest, the biggest hindrance to me receiving equal pay are educational instructors that take a pittance for teaching a workshop. I've had more instances where I get a list of people that have attended and accepted $500 for a week. And I have to say, thank you for including me in that company. It's a great company. All of those people have full-time jobs. I'm not going there on vacation. They may be bringing their family and looking at this as a break. I'm not going there to sit on the beach. I actually have to show up in class. This is how I make my living. And what you're paying me doesn't cover my expenses for a week. So thank you very much. And that is over and over and over again. And what I think is really difficult is I'll advocate for a better wage. And I think way to go, Sunshine, you did it. And so I'll get paid what I asked for. I think, awesome, Sunshine, you're making changes. And then I show up to the gig and I am getting paid more than everybody there because like no one else has like complained that $500 for a week worth of work is not acceptable, right? And so I think that's where this push towards understanding our like advocacy and working towards asking institutions to step up and honor a particular, and I wonder if that maybe even it's just wage guidelines, if we did a kind of consensus among, 50 artists from 50 states and just say, hey, we think this is a fair pay. This is, if you, like that idea of like, you pay for travel, you pay for this, you pay for that. I think of, my sister works in the healthcare industry and she works as a kind of admin assistant. And, it's like, I think about these people that go and they get paid to lecture for a day, right? Or whatever it is. They get paid the same rate for that day of lecturing that they get paid for both days of travel. I've never been paid for a travel day, right? That idea of like, there are industry standards out there that are part of this. So
you remind me of a point that Adam Chow brought up in the conversation was that, there's always another side to these things, right? And he was saying if he gets like, you get a gig at an independent craft organization or you get a gig to come to a university, that he's like, you are going to get paid well at the university. You're going to get fed, you're probably going to get a hotel room, and you're going to have a really great stipend. So that sort of back and forth, but it is interesting, like you get what you ask for and that you have to, to stand up and ask for it. But I liked that Adam made that distinction about where you go. And it also, when you were talking, it reminded me that we just keep circling these conversations, they're in Studio Potter archives, there's a conversation, a back and forth between Warren McKinsey and Garth Clark about this very topic versus, right, what educators make versus people who are making a living as potters.
It is not my experience that you get paid well at universities for a gig. Like gig work at universities is not there to me, because I think that's the thing too. I'm always like, because I think there was this tradition back in the day that all these ceramic artists that got gigs at universities, they would swap with each other. Of like, oh, you come do a workshop at my place, I'll do a workshop, just cover my travel. Right? So they basically didn't set up the system in which they paid their visiting artists particularly well. Right? And so I don't even know how many conversations I've had with university instructors where they kind of gasp when I tell them what my day wage, my day rate is. They're like, I don't think I'm going to be able to get that. And I was like, okay, thanks. Good luck. And they're like, well, so-and-so came for this much. And I was like, you asked me? I don't need to go to North Dakota. Like if you would like me to come, this is what you're going to pay. And I think what is interesting is there is still and maybe part of it is being a woman. Like that could be a big part of, that is always where I get that's a lot of money, little lady kind of conversation. And I'm just like, it takes everything for me not to, and luckily it's usually via email or a phone conversation, so they can't see my face. But I also, we run into that too a lot, I think, as I have a couple friends that I'm always kind of admonishing, because your friends like in the field that ask you to do a favor and don't pay you, they're not your friends. I'm just going to say that right now. Your friends should want to pay you well. They shouldn't want to take advantage of you. And we have to kind of frame that in that language of like, hey, the math of this is not quite working out. Like, I understand we all have budgeting issues, but my budget dictates this as a fair pay, So it's one of those things that really is it upsets me when I witness that within our field of my generation or a little bit younger generation of people perpetuating this kind of behavior for that next, when I'm like, no, I want to pave the way so it's better and easier on the people coming up behind me.
Yeah, I think, that conversation of service to the field, I love that it has bubbled up in almost every conversation around this topic that I've had, and that it comes up again with you too. But like, what is that burden of responsibility, even if you're just struggling to like make ends meet yourself. Like, what obligation do you have to like make the road easier for those coming up behind you? I wrote, are you familiar with the podcast Freakonomics? I wrote to them and asked them about how does a system begin to change and what are the right questions for artists to ask. Is the gallery system destined to die, or is it just going to get relegated to ever increasing an elite audience? You know, they're very big. I acknowledge that these are very big, even unanswerable questions. He says, my initial reaction is that these are very familiar problems that arise when there are power differentials across levels of what economists call the supply chain. The galleries have some market power, which they exploit, but the creators hate this. They feel powerless because they need the outlet. At the same time, they make moves to disintermediate and sell directly to customers. And he says that he's seen this in the travel industry, real estate, and book publishing. And then complicating it all, he says, especially now, is that the galleries aren't doing well financially, and so they really don't have much to give back. So I just wanted to share that with you and see what you thought. I mean, I think I've got an idea of what you thought about that.
It's interesting because what I do feel like with the current world of like, I think about what my business practice was 10 years ago and what it is now, is that access to market has changed. You know, I think there is something that's shifting there, and that and I do believe there is, because I think we're all in this, at this moment, I want to say this is like, we're all in this kind of time warp. Like some things this year has utterly shifted everything in so many ways. And I think there is this adapt or die feeling I have about the world. And I also have this, like, I have, you know, I can support people. Like I can take people under my wing. I can answer their questions. I can be supportive. And institutions are full of people, but do I want a person to burn down versus an institution to burn down? Like I'm okay with an institution burning down because we can rebuild and change the face of that and maybe make it more in our collective image. That's like also like I think about my practice of like my income structure burnt down and I had to readapt and say, okay, and I think there is this space of like when we move forward or when we're confronted by these kind of huge changes in our industry of defining who I am and what I want my business and what I want my creative practice to be. And I think as for an artist and maker, there's a correlation between how I choose to do business versus what maybe an economist would look at what business is, right? I think we tried to, or at least I tried to marry a bit of my personal ethics and belief in, I make these kind of bizarre things, like this kind of absurd thing that I ask people to spend time with. And so for me, there is this correlation. What I want to say is that we have to kind of really have a strong definition of what our ethical and moral like model is and how we want, like I think about institutions like here in Montana, we have the break, like places that they're having to figure out and redefine who they want to be in this industry. And I think it's really important that I think from a personal level to an institutional level, there is kind of this reckoning happening right now with our path forward. And I think we have to come back to some kind of moral center and redefine what we want our industry to look like.
In all of these conversations with so many different levels of experience and so many different perspectives, it really seemed to me that the larger arc is that it always comes down to things being a case-by-case basis, personal systems of embedded assessment, and one-on-one conversations. Do you think that's an oversimplification?
I do believe that, I think those are pretty spot on in a weird way. Like we have to, I think I would add in there too, there's this, unfortunately, I do believe it's a case by case thing. I think there has been some work or thoughts towards, especially with racial and gender diversity issues, like having a much more kind of solid ask with those types of things towards institutions. Like to me, it comes back to the last question of like, if you know what your center is and what your boundaries are and what your hard line is, those conversations become a lot easier because you can say, okay, thank you. We don't have to take that personally. I think we can initially have a lot of those conversations with people and be really hurt by them. And instead of looking at that as like, as much as I'm speaking to an individual, I'm also speaking to an individual that represents an institution, and that institution has its priorities are that person's priorities. And like that's how I kind of have to treat those.
Sunshine, I wanted to thank you for being so generous with your time and your expertise. You certainly have, the fact that your name came up so frequently in this conversation, I think shows a respect for what you have cut out for yourself and the model that you're putting forward.
I'm happy to help. Thank you for having this conversation. I appreciate it. And I hope people, hear it. And like, I get lots of people who, I'm always happy to answer questions. So people are welcome to email me or, ask for advice and stuff like that. I try to respond as much as I can, Instagram or email.
All right. Bye, girl.
Okay. Bye.